A revolutionary walks among refugees forgotten by the world. What he promised that night would change history forever, but the world never knew the truth. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers and motivate us to bring you even more revealing historical content. June 1959. Barely 6 months after the revolutionary triumph in Cuba, Ernesto Che Guevara received from Fidel Castro a mission that would forever change his political perspective. To travel through 14 countries in 3 months under the pretext of a goodwill mission. The real objective was far more ambitious: to build an international support network for the young Cuban Revolution and distance itself from American influence that threatened to economically strangle the island. Che, that Argentine doctor turned legendary guerrilla fighter of the Sierra Maestra, had proven himself as effective with a rifle as with his revolutionary ideas. Washington watched him with growing concern. Every country he visited, every speech he delivered, represented a potential threat to American interests worldwide. The first stop was Egypt. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the leader who had nationalized the Suez Canal and defied the colonial powers just 3 years earlier, was waiting for Che with a specific plan. Nasser was at that moment the living symbol of pan-Arabism and anti-colonial resistance. He had humiliated France, England, and Israel during the 1956 Suez Crisis, becoming the hero of the Arab world. In a private meeting in Cairo, Nasser looked directly at Che and made him an unexpected proposal. "Commander Guevara, there is a place you must see, a place where my people face the most brutal colonial injustice. Will you visit the Gaza Strip?" Che accepted without hesitation. At that moment, Gaza was under temporary Egyptian administration. It was home to more than 120,000 Palestinian refugees, entire families violently expelled from their lands during the 1948 Nakba. 11 years had passed since Zionist militias forced them to abandon their towns and cities. 11 years living in makeshift tents, waiting for the right of return that the United Nations had promised them but never fulfilled. Nobody in Cuba knew exactly what Fidel expected from this visit. Nobody imagined that what Che would witness in Gaza would completely transform his understanding of the global anti-imperialist struggle. In June 1959, during his visit to Egypt, Che Guevara arrived in the Gaza Strip. What he saw there destroyed any remnant of political innocence he might have preserved. The Al-Bureij refugee camp stretched before his eyes like a labyrinth of organized despair. Tents formed narrow alleyways of dirt and dust. Entire families lived in tiny spaces without running water, without electricity, without visible prospects for the future. Barefoot children played among the misery with a joy that contrasted brutally with their living conditions. Elderly people sat in the shade of the tents, gazing toward the horizon, eternally waiting to return to homes that perhaps no longer existed. Che had seen poverty before. He had traveled through Latin America as a young doctor, witnessing the exploitation of Guatemalan peasants, the misery of Bolivian miners, the suffering of Cuban cane cutters. He had fought in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, watching his comrades in arms die. But nothing had prepared him for the systematized injustice he encountered in Gaza. According to popular accounts that circulated later, Che supposedly witnessed the Palestinian refugees' tradition of keeping the keys to their former homes. An elderly Palestinian woman, according to these narratives, would have shown him the key to her house in Haifa, explaining, "We keep these keys because we know that someday we will return." Che took the key in his hands. He felt the weight of the cold metal, the weight of 11 years of forced exile, the weight of an injustice that defied all description. Che Guevara, the steel guerrilla who had executed traitors without flinching, the revolutionary who had witnessed the death of his comrades in combat without showing weakness, was reportedly deeply moved according to witnesses who accompanied him, displaying an unusual emotionality for him. In that precise moment, Che experienced a fundamental political revelation. The Palestinian struggle was not simply a Middle Eastern territorial dispute, just another conflict in the international pages of newspapers. It was exactly the same struggle he had witnessed in Guatemala when the CIA orchestrated the coup against President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. It was the same struggle he had seen in Bolivia, where American mining companies brutally exploited indigenous workers. It was the perpetual struggle of all Latin America under North American imperialism. The struggle of colonized peoples against imperialism was one and the same, regardless of continent, regardless of language, regardless of religion. It was global, it was universal, it was the same war on different fronts. Che visited a second camp, Al-Nuseirat. There he met the Fedayeen, the Palestinian guerrillas, who carried out daring operations against Israeli occupation forces. They were young, some barely teenagers, with faces weathered by the relentless desert sun and eyes bright with absolute determination. They were willing to die to recover their land. Che observed them with the critical eye of a military strategist. He asked them direct and blunt questions. Where are your organized training camps? Where are your modern weapons? Why aren't you structured as a professional guerrilla force? Why don't you fight day and night with coordinated strategy for your freedom? The young Palestinians listened with reverent attention. The legendary Che Guevara, the man who had defeated Batista's professional army against all odds, stood before them offering direct military advice. There exists a popular narrative, though not documented in primary sources, that a young man named Mohammed Mahmoud al-Aswad, who would later become a PFLP commander, was supposedly present at these meetings or was inspired by Che's visit to Gaza. He retained vague memories of his hometown before his family was violently expelled. His eyes shone intensely as he listened to every word from the Argentine revolutionary about guerrilla tactics, liberation warfare, armed resistance, effective ambushes, and the crucial importance of winning civilian population support. That boy, deeply inspired by Che's words on that hot June afternoon, would grow up to become Gaza's most feared commander. The Israelis would end up calling him simply the Guevara of Gaza. Che returned to Cuba with revolutionary fire in his heart and a clear mission engraved in his mind. According to historical interpretations based on Che's internationalist thinking, it is plausible that he discussed with Fidel Castro the possibility of Cuban support for the Palestinian resistance, although there are no documented records of specific formal proposals at that time. The differences in approach between Che's revolutionary idealism and Fidel Castro's political pragmatism are well documented. It is reasonable to infer that they would have discussed Cuba's limits in openly supporting international revolutionary causes given its proximity to the United States and the pressures facing the young revolution. Che understood Fidel's strategic logic, but his revolutionary heart rebelled against the necessary political prudence. Here begins the most intriguing historical enigma. Che never wrote about his Gaza visit in his official reports from the Goodwill mission. He never mentioned it in press conferences organized after returning to Cuba. It never appeared in his posthumously published diaries. He never spoke publicly about the specific promises he had made to the Palestinian refugees. The reasons for this absolute silence remain speculative. Some specialized historians believe that Fidel explicitly asked him to keep the visit secret to avoid simultaneously provoking the United States and Israel. Other researchers think that Che himself decided to keep his promises to the Palestinians private, knowing he could not fulfill them immediately and not wanting to create cruel false hopes. Some people speculate that the visit was so emotional, so deeply personal, that Che simply could not find the adequate words to describe it appropriately. However, documentary photographs do not lie. Images of Che walking among the tents circulated widely in international newspapers. Photos of him conversing with Palestinian refugees, holding children in his arms, smoking his usual cigar while attentively listening to the heartbreaking stories of the elderly. The world observed the Latin American revolutionary directly showing solidarity with the Palestinian people, and something fundamental changed in global political consciousness at that precise moment. Palestine stopped being exclusively a regional Middle Eastern problem, a footnote in the international pages of Western newspapers. It transformed into a global cause, a universal symbol of anti-imperialist resistance, a banner that united the oppressed of all continents under a common struggle. The following years witnessed how Che's influence in Palestine grew like a fertile seed in prepared soil. During the 1960s, leftist Palestinian leaders massively adopted the guerrilla tactics that Che had perfected in Cuba and later in Bolivia. George Habash of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Naif Hawatmeh of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine meticulously studied Che's writings. They translated his guerrilla warfare manuals into Arabic. They carefully adapted his military strategies to the specific Palestinian terrain. Che's theory of the revolutionary FOCO, based on small vanguard groups capable of igniting a massive popular uprising, became the central strategy adopted by multiple factions of the Palestinian resistance. In the training camps established in Lebanon during the 70s, something extraordinary and symbolically powerful happened. The Palestinians named several of their military training camps Camp Che Guevara. There, generations of young fighters learned the exact same techniques that Che had employed in the Sierra Maestra: ambush tactics, psychological warfare against the enemy, systematically winning civilian population support, living off local resources, applying the strategy of striking quickly and withdrawing before the enemy's response. Che's iconic image appeared in giant murals throughout the Middle East, painted alongside Gamal Abdel Nasser and Yasser Arafat. Streets in Gaza and the West Bank were named after him. In the Al-Nuseirat refugee camp, exactly the same one Che visited in 1959, young leftist activists founded in the 90s the Che Guevara Cultural Club, a dedicated space where revolutionary theory was studied, liberation political strategy was discussed, and the memory of the Argentine who had visited them decades earlier and never forgot them was kept alive. Mohammed al-Aswad, who would become a prominent commander of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, belonged to a generation of Palestinians who grew up under the influence of revolutionary thinking that Che Guevara helped spread in the Arab world. According to popular accounts circulating in Palestinian collective memory, figures of the Israeli leadership supposedly recognized the difficulty of completely controlling Gaza, where the resistance maintained a constant presence. Mohammed al-Aswad became a legendary figure of this resistance. Mohammed al-Aswad fell as a martyr on March 9, 1973, in a violent confrontation with the Israeli army in Gaza's streets. He died exactly as he had lived, fighting until his last breath. But his legacy, like Che Guevara's, continues to live eternally in the streets he defended with his life. On October 9, 1967, in the remote mountains of Bolivia, in a forgotten town called La Higuera, Che Guevara, seriously wounded in combat and captured by the Bolivian army, was summarily executed by direct CIA orders. They cut off his hands to confirm his identity through fingerprints. They buried him in a secret grave that remained hidden for 30 years. Barely 4 months before Che's execution, Israel had completely occupied the Gaza Strip during the devastating Six-Day War, militarily crushing the combined armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in less than a week. Two historical tragedies, two fallen revolutionary heroes in the same global anti-imperialist struggle. one executed in the mountains of Latin America by the CIA, another crushed by decades of military occupation in the Middle East, one murdered by direct orders from Washington, another defeated by Washington's main ally in the region. In 1964, 3 years before his death, Che had spoken before the United Nations General Assembly in New York. Before the diplomatic representatives of the entire world, dressed in his characteristic olive green uniform and black beret, his words were absolutely clear and without possible ambiguity. The Cuban delegation extends fraternal greetings to the peoples of southern Rhodesia, Southwest Africa, and to the Arabs of Palestine. We unequivocally reaffirm our support for all peoples in active conflict with imperialism and colonialism. A year later, during the Afro-Asian Conference in Algiers, Che again explicitly mentioned and passionately defended the Palestinian cause before the international community. Cuba became one of the first countries to officially recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1964, when most Western countries still did not even recognize the very existence of the Palestinian people as a legitimate political entity. In 2021, 62 years after Che's historic visit to Gaza, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine organized a massive demonstration in Gaza's devastated streets. Thousands of people marched through streets repeatedly destroyed by Israeli bombings. In their hands, they carried red flags with Che Guevara's iconic face. Palestinian women guerrillas paraded in their military uniforms. Armed men marched in disciplined formation. Children waved flags enthusiastically. Elderly people who personally remembered 1959 walked emotionally, all raising the image of the Argentine revolutionary who visited them 62 years earlier and never abandoned them in his memory. Aleida Guevara, Che's daughter and a physician like her father, has publicly expressed on various occasions her support for the Palestinian cause, keeping alive her father's internationalist commitment to peoples struggling for their liberation. The secret that Western history books deliberately omit is this: Che's visit to Gaza was not an empty diplomatic gesture, convenient political tourism, nor a simple publicity photo for international consumption. It was the precise historical moment when two geographically distant revolutions, Latin America and Palestine, met and recognized each other as sisters in the same global struggle. It was the defining moment when the anti-imperialist struggle became truly global, when the world's oppressed understood with absolute clarity that their enemy was exactly the same system, regardless of whether they spoke Spanish, Arabic, English, or any other language. Imperialism had no borders, therefore resistance should not have them either. In the streets of Gaza, as in many places in the world where liberation struggles persist, graffiti with Che Guevara's image has appeared over the years, symbolizing the continuity of the revolutionary struggle. Because that is the final and undeniable historical truth. 65 years after that transformative visit to Gaza, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the refugees that Che personally met still fight for their fundamental freedom. The rusty keys are still jealously kept in family drawers and pockets, waiting to open doors of houses that perhaps physically no longer exist. The refugee camps remain there, now built of concrete instead of canvas, but equally provisional in the consciousness of their inhabitants. The resistance persists relentlessly, generation after generation, showing no signs of surrender. And the imperishable legacy of Che Guevara, that middle-class Argentine doctor who deliberately abandoned the comfort of an assured bourgeois life to fight for the world's oppressed, remains absolutely alive in every stone thrown against the occupation, in every defiantly waving Palestinian flag, in every refugee child who resolutely refuses to forget their ancestors' land. Until victory always. Those were Che's last documented words before being coldly executed in La Higuera. And today, in Gaza, in the West Bank, throughout Latin America, in every forgotten corner of the world where injustice persists, where occupation continues, where resistance against oppression exists, those words still resonate powerfully as a war cry that transcends generations and borders. Because true revolution recognizes no artificial borders, and the struggle for freedom and human dignity never, absolutely never ends while a single oppressed people exists anywhere on the planet.